Hi, everyone. First off, thank you for being here, and thank you to the organizers for putting this conference together. My name is Alexander Vandewalle, and I'm a joint PhD researcher at the University of Antwerp and Ghent University in Belgium, where I study the characterization of Greco-Roman gods and heroes in contemporary video games. The title of my talk today is Towards a Mythological Game Studies, in which I want to address the reception of mythology in video games, or perhaps more accurately, the study of the reception of mythology in games. The past few years have seen a large increase, almost explosion of interest in video games and the ancient world. That's something that this conference shows and something that past editions of this conference have actively contributed to. There's a field even growing very fast called historical game studies, which studies those games that in some way represent the past or relate to discourses about it, the potential applications of such games to different domains of activity and knowledge, and the practices, motivations, and interpretations of players of these games and other stakeholders involved in their production or consumption, as defined by Chapman, Foka, and Weston. Historical game studies is rapidly expanding and has produced many volumes that study games through concepts and ideas of history and sees annual conferences in various parts of the world. However, the study of mythology in games has been a diachronically, but admittedly increasingly less overlooked aspect of video games set in the ancient world. We don't have specific volumes or monographs on mythology in games, while we have more than several on history in games. For example, in Christian Rollinger's volume, a highly influential one that, as Rollinger himself writes, nearly doubles the amount of scholarly output in this field, mythological content is included in some broader survey chapters, but in regards to actual case studies, there are only two chapters that discuss mythological games. One chapter by Claire, which focuses on Titan Quest, and one by Maciej Paprocki, which focuses on the game Apotheon. There are, of course, previous discussions of mythology in games, like those that focus on the external appearance of mythological characters. For example, the work by Pierre Cuvelier and Wei-Sing Tang et al. On Medusa, or those that study strategies of spectacularization of mythological content, like Ross Clare's analysis of God of War. Representation of female mythological characters, like many of the contributions in the new volume by Jane Dracut and Kate Cook, or the topic of deicide, as studied by Gordon, Paprocki, and Norgard. And these are highly important topics, but with perhaps a couple of exceptions, there isn't that much research that studies what the medium of games, and specifically the medium of games, can offer mythology, or that applies mythology theory to games in the same way that historical game studies have employed history theory to describe historical games. Games, for example, are participatory simulations that require active, non-trivial player input. And like other digital environments, they are highly spatial, meaning that they present a virtual space which players are invited to explore. How do these intrinsic qualities incorporate features of mythology, and how is mythology used specifically in such a context? And these are huge research questions, and by no means do I pretend to hold the answers to them. But what I can do is use this space as a platform for scholarly conversation, um, uh, and conceptualize a mythological equivalent to historical game studies, a mythological game studies, if you will, that concentrates on the development of ideas about how mythology and games can and do intersect. Such a mythological game studies isn't something that needs to be invented as much as it is something in which needs to be invested. Like I said earlier, there already exist many excellent studies on this topic, such as the new contributions in the Women in Classical Video Games volume, or the research thread on deicide, which perfectly fits the research field proposed here. But it is an area of research that is still in its infancy, especially when compared to the high velocity with which the field of historical game studies has evolved in what leading researchers from the Netherlands have described as a roller coaster decade for the past playground. So what I want to do in this presentation is discuss some ideas and perhaps provide some springboards that jumpstart further research. Specifically, I would like to focus on three separate but interrelated topics, which each discuss the intersection between games and mythology. First, I would like to talk about mythological reenactment. second about mythological authenticity, and third about intermythological storytelling. I realize this may initially seem like a barrage of terminology, but these are all aspects that players of mythological games are confronted with almost constantly. All of this is, of course, very much open to discussion. I am looking forward to the conversations during the actual conference event. The first basic way to look at mythological video games is to consider how they structure story and action. And one way in which players are involved in mythological games is through the reenactment or emulation of well-known myths or stories. This is self-evident in cases such as Warriors, Legend of Troy, or Total War Saga Troy, both of which present the Trojan War as the center of attention. The same goes for games like Rise of the Argonauts or Theseus' Journey to Athens, which, keeping in mind some creative liberties, reenact ancient stories. Yet mythological reenactment is also present in games that tell their own stories, and often lies at the basis of the characterization of video game heroes. It is striking, for example, how often contemporary video games create original, i.e. new mythic Greek heroes. Kratos, Phoenix, Cassandra, Arkantos, Nicandrios, Pit Iola are all original contemporary creations and embark on their own paths similar to the Greek heroes. This seems to be less the case in contemporary cinema or television, which tend to revolve more around established Greek heroes like Achilles, Hercules, or Odysseus. There are exceptions, of course, like Percy Jackson or Chiron in Blood of Zeus, but a possible reason why games seem to create new heroes more often, I think, is because these characters then exist as a blank slate that players may then customize to their liking. And this is, of course, directly connected to the non-trivial input that players are required to perform in video games. So what is interesting here is that these games often elevate these new heroes to a similar level or the same status of hero as the well-known established heroes from myth. In Immortals Fenyx Rising, for instance, part of Phoenix's journey through the realm of Athena revolves around Phoenix walking the path of the heroes. Phoenix is required to go to different steles in the region to learn about the Greek heroes, in this case, Atalanta, Achilles, Odysseus, and Heracles. Moreover, Phoenix reenacts many of the heroic feats of these heroes, including defeating Polyphemus, hunting Atalanta's boar, fighting the Nemean lion, and so on. Additionally, Phoenix wields the weapons of these characters, such as the bow of Odysseus or the axe of Atalanta, and performs abilities named after them, like Heracles' strength. Eventually, Phoenix even defeats these heroes in battle, and after doing so, is summoned to the tomb of the heroes underneath Athena's statue, and is formally promoted to Greek hero alongside the other heroes from whom they've learned. So we see here that the reenactment of myth, by which I mean the performance of heroic deeds known from the ancient world, serves as the basis of the characterization of Phoenix as a Greek hero of a similar sort as the ones that we already know, Achilles, Hercules, and so on. Mythological reenactment is thus not only a way to structure player participation in the game, but also to build the new player character along similar lines as the established heroes of Greek myth. And mythological reenactment shouldn't necessarily be seen as the one and only narrative form that drives all mythological games. For example, the aforementioned research on deicide shows the clearest counterexample to mythological reenactment. Even though the possibility of killing a god in Greek mythology is still debated, it's clear that even if it wasn't as widespread as it was, for example, in Norse mythology. Rather, these instances of mythological reenactment should most likely be seen as just that, instances, moments, scenes, quests, or specific boss fights, which create agency in the mythical ludonarrative and potentially creates heroic character development for the player's character. What mythological reenactment can potentially also lead to is mythological authenticity. Authenticity is a much debated concept in historical game studies, which roughly refers to a subjective feeling of genuineness experienced on the part of the player. It is different from accuracy in that accuracy is a claimed intrinsic quality of fidelity. A recreation of a historical environment supposedly is accurate, whereas authenticity refers to a feeling that a game environment potentially induces in its players. And we don't necessarily have to look at these feelings as directly linked to ancient fragments or counterparts. We could, of course, but we don't have to. As Ross Clare noted in his transmedial approach to antiquity games, audiences have informal ideas of a popular antiquity, informed by modern receptions rather than by ancient literature. The sense of mythological authenticity then depends on how elements from ancient myths that in the popular imagination or contemporary are generalizingly constitutive of these myths are deployed to provide an experience of these myths that makes it seem as if the player is actually partaking or immersed in one of these mythic stories themselves. Research has identified several elements that may facilitate authenticity in historical games, such as atmosphere, music, use of language, promotional material, or their possible experiences and affordances. Similarly, in a survey study that we did last year, we found that the primary aspect that contributes to players' sense of realness in historical games is their so-called social realism, or a dimension of realism that describes how in-game worlds resemble real-life worlds, which in historical games includes questions of accuracy and authenticity. So a large part of what potentially creates authenticity in historical games is the world and the sensory experience of that world. But how could we conceptualize authenticity in mythological video games? How do audiences feel like they are authentically visiting a mythological location? At first glance, the responsibility of mythological authenticity would seem to depend less on the audio-visual characteristics of the game world. For example, a very common setting of mythological games is the Greek underworld, yet representations of the underworld vary incredibly. From the nebulous Vault of Tartarus in Immortals Phoenix Rising to the more sci-fi elements of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, or the more cutesy aesthetic of Persephone, to the more death-inspired underworld by in Hades, which is generated procedurally. It's no use trying to describe these representations in terms of their accuracy to the Greek underworld, which of course doesn't exist and was already described in Antiquity in various ways. They might, however, induce authenticity, though perhaps not directly through the fidelity of their game world. In such cases, the world perhaps loses part of its audio-visual referentiality and more deeply becomes a mythic story world, which is how Sarah Iles Johnson conceptualized the world of Greek myth in her 2018 The Story of Myth. Johnson describes how the intertwined storytelling of Greek myths created a coherent and credible world for the ancient Greeks. And in games, we have seen that story world becomes participatory. Players act in order to move the story forward. Consider in this context the following exchange from one of the opening scenes of Immortals Phoenix Rising, where Prometheus narrates to Zeus what the protagonist Phoenix is doing.
This is the largest statue of Hermes I've ever seen. I wonder who built it.
Besieged by challenge, totally alone, this young hero was determined to save her fellow soldiers and brother...
Boring! Can we skip this part?
No, this is important for the sense of atmosphere.
Here, the explicitly mentioned concept of atmosphere, which we previously indicated can induce authenticity, is connected not to the environment, but to the story and the narrative structure of the game. Perhaps this is also why pre-orders of Assassin's Creed Odyssey came with a map of the game space, whereas years after its release, Immortals Phoenix Rising was expanded with a book called A Traveler's Guide to the Golden Isle, telling the mythological stories of that world. It's important to look into these paratexts as well, given that recent research has pointed out that one of the primary goals of such paratexts is to create a sense of authenticity. And sure, that Phoenix Rising book is a traveler's guide to the Golden Isle and discusses the world of the game, but it does so by elaborating on the stories found within that world. The world of Phoenix Rising is intrinsically made up of stories connected to the characters found in the narrative. And I think it's those characters and their intertwining narratives that create a compelling story world, and by extension, perhaps, a sense of mythological authenticity. Of course, the world doesn't completely lose its potential powers for authenticity. In Hades, for example, the frequent skeleton imagery also adds to the authenticity of the game as the underworld, a place of death. But in general, I expect that mythological authenticity would rely primarily on characters and storytelling. All of this is a hypothesis, of course, which needs to be studied further. As Felix Zimmermann wrote in his study on the link between authenticity and atmosphere, it is hardly possible to precisely determine what players are doing, thinking, or feeling when arriving at these crossroads in the game, and it would be a futile endeavor to speculate on it without conducting elaborate reception and user studies. And preferably, I think we would indeed study this through audience surveys inspired by the social sciences branch of game studies, like I showed previously with our study of players' perceived realism of historical video games. Should we want to replicate studies like these for mythological video games, I think our focus should be less with the social aspect of these worlds, so the extent to which they resemble our own world, but more with the narrative and the character aspects of them. Finally, we could look at instances in games of what we could call intermythological storytelling, by which I mean stories that combine different mythological traditions into one and the same diegetic story world, and potentially draw attention to differences or similarities between these traditions, akin, for example, to some ideas of comparative mythology. This is a classical reception trope that I believe is found much more often in games than in television or film. The most recent exception of this would, of course, be Thor: Love and Thunder, where Thor encounters Zeus and other gods from many different cultures. But in games, this is much more frequent. Think of Age of Mythology, or Titan Quest, or Smite, or the recent Norse-based God of War games, or the Assassin's Creed Isugas, or the Chinese DLC for Immortals Phoenix Rising, or even the recent deck-building game Ancient Gods, and so on. These all combine different mythologies within one and the same diegetic story world. Now, how could the popularity of this trope in games be explained? One possible inspiration that we could cite here is superhero storytelling. Joel Gordon has shown how contemporary fiction considers gods in relatively similar ways as modern superheroes. They're supernatural characters with spectacular powers and, most strikingly, the ability to die. In superhero comics, what are known as crossover narratives have been popular and a staple narrative form since the 1960s. Take, for example, the first issue of The Amazing Spider-Man from 1963, where Spider-Man first meets the Fantastic Four. And this comic specifically advertises this meeting as an extra added attraction on the bottom of its cover, meaning that fans like it when characters from different contexts cross over with one another. Crossover superhero stories, of course, remain popular to this day, with two of the Avengers films making it into the top 5 movies of all time. But this doesn't necessarily explain why this trope seems to be so popular in games, so we'll have to look in different directions as well. I mentioned earlier that games have the potential for explorable spatiality, and Janet Murray describes spatial as one of the 4 basic characteristics of narrative in the age of cyberspace. So we might find an answer in level design theory. As Scott Rogers explains in a chapter on themed levels, one important variable in level design is the variety of the levels depicted. There's these common environments like the fire level, or the underwater level, or the ice level. And these, Rogers writes, add color, red and blue, to the palette of game worlds. Such questions of variety, both in terms of color and in terms of environment, may be a more plausible reason why we find intermythological storytelling in games. For example, in the case of the intermythological game Loki: Heroes of Mythology, in which players choose to play as an Egyptian, Greek, Norse, or Aztec hero and travel to each of these worlds, the lead artist, Thomas Voglen, described the production process as follows. When we started development, we were looking for a setting. We decided on different mythologies because we wanted variety, very different worlds, each with its own strengths. So we decided to build Loki in 4 acts, each in a different mythology. We wanted the player to visit plenty of different places, each very different from the other. You will visit Egyptian deserts, snowy mountains of Niflheim, volcanoes, the Aztec jungle, infernos, capital cities. You will participate in the fall of Troy, cross the Styx, explore the icy plains of Midgard, try to get out of Minos' labyrinth, just to name a few. We see that considerations of game world variety shape how the game becomes an intermythological narrative and how the game receives antiquity. Common tropes like the fire or ice levels are recontextualized here as mythological settings like the snowy mountains of Niflheim. And we find such visual variety in basically all of the aforementioned intermythological games. Dunson Lowe has remarked how a similar situation exists in fighting games, where the backgrounds of different levels depict different ancient cultures, and how that leads to a form of digital tourism to different antiquities or mythologies. In this way, intermythological storytelling perhaps serves as a mode of mythology tourism, where players travel between mythic worlds almost like virtual tourists. Similarly, Sorat Ziegelmeier found that in intermythological games like Age of Mythology, different musical themes are used to identify different ancient cultures and to create an auditory variety between game worlds, similar to the visual one that we just described. This hypothesis of intermythology being linked to level design potentially gains even more credibility once we realize that some of these games are spin-offs of historical video games, such as Age of Mythology in the Age of Empires franchise, similarly built on the intersection of various historical cultures. In conclusion, I hope that this paper has presented some useful ways in which we can think about mythology in games. I think that the three concepts that I discussed here are clear examples of how the characteristics of the game medium, which is determined by participation, spatiality, and designed experientiality, impact how games can receive mythology. Participation leads to reenactment, spatiality leads to intermythological variety, both of which may in turn lead to a sense of authenticity as a designed mythological experience. I want to emphasize again that these are really preliminary analyses open to much discussion and that they contribute to an already existing foundation of a proposed mythological game studies from recent developments in the field. So thank you for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing all of this during the actual conference. So see you then.